Lila, Harper, Mia, and Zoe thought they were just planning a fun weekend escape, but what awaited them at the old Millhaven farmhouse was far more terrifying than any story they had ever heard. A night meant for laughter and secrets became a fight for survival as shadows moved, doors slammed, and a sinister presence revealed that the farmhouse had been waiting for them all along. What happened that night would change their lives forever and leave one of them to tell a story no one could believe. The story of the sleepover began as something entirely ordinary, the kind of weekend plan every teenager looks forward to. Four girls, close friends since middle school, decided to spend the night at an old farmhouse that belonged to the grandmother of one of them. The place had been empty for years, ever since the grandmother passed away, and its isolation made it feel like the perfect setting for a night free from rules and restrictions. It was tucked away on the outskirts of Millhaven, where the nearest neighbor was half a mile away, and the only sounds at night were the wind in the trees and the occasional call of an owl. For the girls, this wasn't frightening, it was freedom. They packed snacks, movies, sleeping bags, and even a Ouija board for late-night entertainment, imagining nothing more sinister than a few harmless scares. Yet beneath the excitement, there lingered a shadow that none of them wanted to acknowledge. The farmhouse had a reputation in town, whispered about among older residents. Years before, a man had died in one of the upstairs bedrooms under circumstances that were never fully explained. Some called it an accident, others suspected foul play, but the details had blurred over time into local legend. The story had been passed around so much that it felt like just another ghost tale to spook children, not something to be taken seriously. When they arrived at the house, the girls laughed at its cracked paint and sagging porch, joking about the so-called curse, brushing away every warning they had ever heard. Inside, the air was heavy with dust, and the wooden floors groaned under their steps. Old furniture still filled the rooms, covered in sheets that smelled faintly of mildew. They explored the house with curiosity, opening drawers filled with yellowed papers and flipping through photo albums left behind, as if stepping into a time capsule that had been forgotten. As the sun began to sink behind the trees, they settled into the living room with their sleeping bags spread out across the floor. The atmosphere was cheerful, filled with the chatter of secrets, laughter, and the comfort of being together. But once night fully descended, the tone began to shift. The walls seemed to creak more loudly, the silence between their conversations stretched longer, and the shadows cast by the dim lamp seemed to twist unnaturally. At first, it was just an uneasy feeling, a sense that the house was listening to them. None of them said it aloud, but deep down, each girl felt a shiver of doubt. This was no ordinary sleepover. Something about the farmhouse was awake. As the clock struck midnight, the girls' laughter had begun to fade, replaced by a tense awareness that they were no longer alone. One of them noticed the front door, which they were certain had been locked earlier, now standing wide open. A cold breeze swept through the house, carrying a sharp, metallic scent that none of them could place. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but it set their nerves on edge. They checked the door repeatedly, each time finding it open again, as though the house itself was playing with them. The farmhouse, which had seemed charming and mysterious in daylight, now felt like a trap. The power flickered sporadically, plunging the rooms into darkness for a few terrifying seconds before the lights returned. Shadows danced across the walls, stretching and twisting in impossible ways. The grandfather clock in the hall, which had stood silent all day, began to chime unevenly, its heavy strikes echoing down the empty corridors long past midnight. Each sound felt deliberate, as if announcing that the house had taken notice of them. Their initial excitement had been replaced with unease, but curiosity kept them moving, trying to make sense of the strange phenomena. Upstairs, one of the girls paused mid-step when she thought she heard footsteps pacing just outside the bedroom door. Every instinct screamed to run, but when they opened the door, the hallway was empty, yet the air felt charged, like static before a storm. Then they noticed it, muddy footprints on the wooden floorboards, leading from the back porch into the kitchen. The tracks stopped abruptly, vanishing as if the person who made them had disappeared into thin air. The girls stared at the prints, frozen in disbelief, their imagination racing. How could someone have entered and left without being seen? And why? Every creak of the old house seemed amplified in the silence that followed. The familiar sounds of wind and distant wildlife now seemed sinister. as if echoing some unseen presence moving just beyond the edges of light. Their flashlights, the only source of illumination besides the flickering overhead lights, created more shadows than they dispelled, elongating corners and making the walls appear closer than they were. What had begun as a fun, carefree night had shifted into something much darker, something that none of them were prepared to face. The farmhouse no longer felt abandoned. It felt alive, aware, and patient, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal its secrets. By the time they gathered in the living room, huddled together for comfort, a silent agreement passed among them: they were being watched. The house was no longer just a backdrop for their adventure. It was an active participant, and the sleepover had become far more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. The tension in the farmhouse thickened as the night wore on. Fear had begun to seep into every movement, every glance, until the girls stuck close together, their nerves fraying with each creak of the floorboards. The air smelled damp and musty, as though the house itself was breathing around them. Their flashlights bobbed through the darkness, revealing long shadows that seemed to shift and twist on their own. Each room they entered looked familiar, yet unsettling, as if the house had rearranged itself while they weren't looking. Desperate to understand what was happening, they began a careful search of each room, their movements deliberate and slow. Nothing seemed out of place at first, just old furniture, dusty curtains, and stacks of forgotten belongings. But every sound made them jump, a soft thud from the ceiling, the scraping of something heavy across the floor, and faint, unidentifiable whispers carried on the drafty air. It was impossible to tell whether the noises were real or the product of their terrified imaginations. They tried to reach for their phones, hoping to call someone for help, but every device had lost signal. The screens flickered uselessly, showing no service despite having worked perfectly before entering the house. Panic set in as the realization hit that they might be completely cut off from the outside world. One girl suggested using the landline, hoping it had survived the years untouched. But when they picked up the receiver, only static greeted them, broken by distant, muffled whispers that sent chills down their spines. Then the basement erupted with a sound that made their hearts leap, an unmistakable crash, loud and violent, like a piece of furniture thrown with force. Trembling, they gathered what courage they had and descended the narrow staircase, flashlights shaking in their hands. The basement smelled of damp earth, mold, and something far fouler, metallic and coppery, that made their stomachs turn. The beam of their flashlights revealed a mattress pressed into the corner, its surface stained dark, and a thick coil of rope lying neatly beside it. The sight was horrifying, a jarring confirmation that someone or something had been in the house in ways they could not comprehend. The mattress bore the mark of past violence, the rope suggesting restraint. Fear surged into panic as the girls realized that this was no longer a prank or a harmless haunting. Whatever had been in the house had left tangible evidence of its presence. The basement seemed to close in around them, the shadows growing longer and darker, and the feeling that the farmhouse was no longer just a setting, but an active, malevolent force settled over them with suffocating certainty. The discovery in the basement had shattered whatever sense of security the girls had left. Each step they took felt heavier, as if the house itself resisted their movements. They rushed toward the front door, desperate to escape, only to find it locked tight, the old wood swollen and unyielding. Panic set in, sharp and immediate. Every window they tried was nailed shut or jammed in place. The farmhouse had become a trap, a labyrinth of walls that refused to yield, and the realization made their fear almost unbearable. Huddled together in the living room, they attempted to create some semblance of safety. Chairs were overturned and doors barricaded, but the house seemed to mock their efforts. Every attempt to protect themselves was met with resistance. Doors slammed shut without warning, a cabinet tipped over as if pushed by an invisible hand, and objects shifted positions when no one was looking. The atmosphere felt alive, charged with a presence that moved just beyond the edge of vision. Shadows slithered across walls, elongating into grotesque shapes that disappeared when they tried to confront them. One girl noticed movement from the corner of her eye, an elongated shadow standing just beyond a cracked bedroom door. Her heart leapt, and she froze in terror, convinced someone or something was watching them. When they approached the door together, flashlights shaking, the hall appeared empty. The oppressive silence that followed was almost worse than the threat itself, a quiet that pressed into their ears and rattled their nerves. Then, carefully placed on the floor, they found a small Polaroid photograph. The photograph was simple yet unnerving. It depicted the four of them, seated in the living room just hours earlier, unaware of the terror that awaited them. None of them had taken the picture, and the camera had not existed in their possession at that time. The Polaroids seemed to confirm what they had feared all along. The house was not simply haunted, it was being watched, studied, catalogued. Every shadow, every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind through the cracked windows now felt deliberate, purposeful. The girls realized that the farmhouse had not only trapped them physically, but had ensnared them in its history, its memory, and its malice. Each sound, each movement seemed orchestrated to break them down, to remind them that they were no longer in control. Fear turned into terror, and terror into something darker, a sense of inevitability. Whatever had begun this night of innocence had escalated into something far beyond their comprehension. By the time dawn threatened to break, they were left with the chilling understanding that the farmhouse had secrets that no light could fully reveal. By the time the first pale light of dawn crept over the horizon, the nightmare of the farmhouse had reached its cruelest conclusion. Only one of the four girls emerged, stumbling barefoot onto the roadside that cut through the dense trees surrounding the property. Her clothes were torn, her hair matted and damp, and her eyes wide with a terror that seemed too heavy for someone so young to bear. She wandered aimlessly for several minutes before a passing motorist spotted her and called the authorities. Her voice was barely coherent as she tried to explain what had happened, but even she could not fully comprehend the events of the night. When law enforcement arrived at the farmhouse, they found a scene of chaos and devastation. Furniture was overturned, floors were scratched and dented, and shattered glass glittered across the living room like tiny shards of ice. The basement, where the girls had discovered the stained mattress and rope, bore the unmistakable signs of a struggle. Blood smears marked the walls and floors, dark and unsettling in the early morning light. It was clear that someone or something had been inside the house, leaving evidence of violence that could not be explained by ordinary means. The most disturbing discovery awaited in the attic. There, investigators found dozens of Polaroid photographs meticulously arranged on shelves and the floor. Each one depicted groups of people who had previously stayed at the farmhouse, their faces frozen in moments of unsuspecting innocence. None of the individuals in the photographs had ever been seen in town again, their disappearances remaining unexplained. The images suggested that the farmhouse had been the site of countless hidden horrors, its walls silently witnessing events that the outside world would never know. Despite extensive investigations, no suspect was ever identified. The lone survivor could offer only fragmented memories, images of shadows and sounds, footsteps that seemed to come from nowhere, and the oppressive sense of being watched. The farmhouse, a once forgotten relic on the outskirts of Millhaven, was boarded up and abandoned, left to decay and wait in silence. Yet the locals whispered that the house retained its sinister presence. Even now, on nights when the moon hangs low and the trees sway with the wind, some claim they can see a faint flash from an upstairs window, as if a camera had been triggered. Others report hearing the faint echo of laughter, not from children, but from something far older and darker. The farmhouse waits, patient and vigilant, a place where innocence comes to be tested and lost. And for those who know the story, the warning is clear. Some doors, once opened, should never be entered.